Howdy, howdy, welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so in today's video, I want to talk about why boomers act like petulant children. And you might think that's an exaggeration. You might think I'm being hyperbolic when I say boomers are basically children in adult bodies. But if you look at the way they protest, where they lay in the street and they block trafficking, they get in the way of just like the simplest things, right? You know, it's almost like they act like petulant babies and children, you know, like lying on the floor, screaming at the top of their lungs, you know, waiting for mommy and daddy to capitulate, is because the fact is they just want to have their way. They're basically acting like children throwing a temper tantrum. Okay, and you might find that and you might ask yourself why this is distinctive, quite literally, to the boomer generation. Why do they act this way, but no other generation acts this way? In fact, a lot of people have been asking, especially when it comes to the Donald Trump presidency, why Zoomers aren't showing up to the No Kings rally, which is I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not pro-liberal. I'm obviously anti-liberal. I don't really care about liberalism because I think it's a stupid ideology, but that's neither here nor there. But the No Kings rally is basically a protest group. It's a protest rally against the presidency of Donald Trump, who are claiming that Donald Trump is acting like a king, and they see him as destroying liberal democracy and replacing it with an authoritarian, dictatorship. That's the logic of the No Kings rally. And one of the questions that a lot of people have been asking, why is it primarily white boomers that are showing up to these rallies to preserve so-called democracy from this evil authoritarian president known as Trump, even though the fact is, anybody who's lived outside of the United States and dealt with the United States as a country, even back then, knows how the United States acts geopolitically. But, let's analyze why boomers act this particular way. Okay, if you haven't noticed it, when I talk about boomers on this particular channel, I very much read in between the lines on everything they say, is because in a sort of sense, every piece of life advice that they give younger generations, when they tell younger generations to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they just need to work hard enough, and then when you actually listen to their advice and they tell you to go buy a 10K property in the countryside, right? Every piece of life advice that they give you is just effectively a self-report of the times that they grew up in. Okay, and so it's more or less just a self-report of how easy that they had it in their times and why their advice is just so batshit off the walls and doesn't make sense now. Okay, and so when people ask why Zoomers don't show up to the No Kings rally, there's a very obvious answer in why younger generations don't show up to preserve liberal democracy. Is because they quite literally don't benefit from it, and they're actively insulted by the same group of people who ask them, oh, why don't they join us to oppose dictator Trump's authoritarian regime? Because they don't care, dude. Okay, for the most of their lives, they know they're never going to have retirement. They're never going to be able to retire. They're going to be working until they die. They're never going to own property, and they're going to rent for the rest of their days. In what world would any person want to preserve that system for themselves? Why the hell would they show up to a rally in support of a system that does not literally benefit them? That's how out of touch boomers are, but that's neither here nor there, because the whole video is about analyzing why boomers act like petulant children. Now, I said that, boomers have, if you look at the advice that they give you, every time they come in the comment section to talk on my channel and they try to basically make a passive-aggressive, snarky remark about how younger generations need to work harder or some nonsense like that, essentially, I've showed this on my post feed for YouTube, that every time they do that, they essentially just self-report the fact is the world that they grew up in, on how privileged they really were, and then when people become aware of that, then they try to move the goalpost and basically say, well, that world never existed and we're never going to go back to it, or, well, if it did, we're never going to go back to it, is because it was the exception and not the rule. And I've talked about that quite extensively on my channel. Now, here's kind of the interesting thing. The reason they act like petulant children, if you haven't already figured it out on where I'm going with this, is because, once again, it's just a self-report of how easy they had it in their own lifetimes. The reason they act like petulant fucking children is because they grew up in a time where what they did and the things that they did, failure was inconsequential to these people in their time. They could do drugs, they could be degenerates, and it would be relatively inconsequential to their existences, because even if they fucked up and got to rock bottom, they could still crawl themselves out of that hellhole to some degree. Okay? That's not the case for younger generations. If you ever wondered, because there's a statistic that came out that younger generations are increasingly abstaining from alcohol and cigarettes and drugs in general. And, a lot of people have kind of dunked on them, calling Gen Z particularly a boring generation, but that's because Gen Z and younger generations know the consequences of what happens when you have vices that effectively ruin your life. Okay, when the average house price is $500,000 and the average rent is $2,000 a month, okay, you literally have no room to fuck up without ending up homeless for the next 5 years of your life, where your teeth fall out because you don't have dental care anymore, okay? And so Zoomers, Gen Z, recognizes this reality, and they would never, ever in their mind cross the path of ever doing something as stupid that boomers could afford to get away with, is because they exist in a time where their failures and their vices and their mistakes was relatively inconsequential to their success in life. With Gen Z, it's not even optional. Because even the people who work their ass off going to college, like myself, doing difficult majors in STEM, you know, get rewarded with underpay or being threatened to be replaced by and having our jobs outsourced, okay? You know, even the people who work hard and do everything right aren't rewarded. What makes you think the world has in store for people who fuck up even once? It's much less forgiving now than it was 75 years ago in the generations that boomers had, or the times that boomers had. Okay? And so when you see boomers lying in the road, you know, standing in front of cars like they're never going to get hit, is because they lived in a world where, you know, they could act like petulant fucking children and, you know, they wouldn't get hit by a car. If a Gen Z person acted the same way boomers did, you know, boomers would essentially try to get them fired and essentially, you know, ruin their lives. They've done this before. That's the mentality of these people, you know. The thing is that the stakes are much higher for younger generations, which is, again, why I've said before, previously, why younger generations engage in radical politics more now than previous generations, is because, again, you know, the consequences of failure aren't that much higher for younger generations, is because they don't have that wiggle room to basically be a fuck up and still be able to pull themselves up. I have a coworker who has a fuck up of a son-in-law. Okay, and he's a nice guy and all that sorts of stuff, but he's totaled 9 cars. But because his house is paid off and he works as an engineer, and this is an older generation guy, he's not a bad guy. But the thing is, he's totaled 9 cars, and, you know, he keeps paying for his son-in-law's cars, okay? That is the world that these people exist in. That's the world boomers existed in, where they could fuck up time and time again, and it was relatively inconsequential to the success in life, and they could pick themselves up and still have a moderately successful life. Nowadays, you could have multiple degrees in STEM, and they will probably try and gaslight you why you need to work harder for less, while house prices go out of control and they still underpay you, okay? And so now that I've explained it, now you understand why boomers act like petulant fucking children. Okay? Now you know why younger generations engage in more violent and radical politics, not because they want to, but because the fact is one generation of people could do relatively inconsequential shit, you know, do drugs and be degenerates, and it wouldn't end their lives, and they wouldn't be forever destitute and poor, you know, and they could still pick themselves up by their bootstraps and have a semi-prosperous life. But the younger generations, even if they do everything right, you know, they're still living paycheck to paycheck, is because there's an entire generation of boomers that have rigged the entire property system where they underbuilt housing for, you know, years. And so they could inflate their asset prices. They worked with BlackRock to lock up the housing supply and make American families renters. And on top of that, you know, even if you do everything right now in this economy, you're still going to be screwed. Okay? You're still going to be living paycheck to paycheck. And it's funny because the fact is because of that reality that younger generations have to live in, they do less drugs. And they do less degenerate things because they don't have the wiggle room to make failures like that. They can't be a pot-smoking loser and then still expect to have an okay life. If they fuck up their lives, it's gone for a very long period of time, and it's going to be like crawling out of hell just to restabilize your life. Okay? And so, I hope that, well, that's my 2 cents on why I think boomers act like petulant children. That's what I've noticed in the mentalities, because if you ever notice it, whenever boomers protest, whether it be leftist boomers or right-wing boomers, okay, they essentially act the same way. They act like whiny children that basically act like petulant children, and they lay on the ground and scream at the top of their lungs like a screaming child would, you know, that had never gotten beaten in their entire lives. And so, you know, they're just used to getting mommy and daddy giving them everything they wanted. That's the thing I've noticed with boomers. Not all of them, because obviously there are always exceptions to every rule. Some people didn't have the most luxurious things. I had people come in my comment section, well, it's like, I didn't have that. And I was like, well, good for you. I'm glad I'm glad that you're a normal person and you grew up to be a respectable human being, because you actually had some degree of suffering in your life. And so that has made you a better and more empathetic person, is because now you can understand other people's perspective and not just your own. Okay? Like, I'm glad about that. You know, if you're a boomer and you didn't go through the stuff that I'm describing, don't take it as a personal attack to you. Is because I've seen some boomers who live on a fixed income, and they're at a point in life where they literally are in the same situation as younger generations because they never entered the property ownership stuff, and inflation's eating up their fixed income. Fixed income at this inflation is just killing people, okay? That's the unfortunate part about how the system works. With that being said, I think I'm going to go ahead and close off the videos because I wasn't planning on making this video too terribly long. You probably noticed it, you know, if you come back to my channels, that I'm very much a quite infrequent uploader. I upload in bursts. Sometimes I feel like talking about some things and I get really yappy, and so I open up my recorder and I start talking into a microphone. But there are other times where I'm gone for like weeks at a time because I'm working on some project in real life. You know, again, because I work as an engineer, I like building things. But, you know, that's what keeps me occupied in real life, you know. So, you know, I have a tendency to disappear off of the internet for a little while to just kind of work on things and, you know, just kind of, you know, take a break. I alternate between things. So that's why, if you haven't noticed it, that when it comes to my channel, I upload videos in bursts. And I know the algorithm rewards people who consistently upload, and that's totally fair and all that sort of stuff. The algorithm is definitely getting more fair now than it was then. But, you know, it is what it is. I'm not going to pretend that I'm like a lot of the other YouTubers where I upload every day. I can't do that stuff. I just upload when I feel like it, when I have, you know, 2 cents that I feel like sharing with people who subscribe to the channel and engaging in a discussion with the people who follow the channel. And sometimes we get hit on the algorithm and, you know, more people see it and more people join. With that being said, that's the one thing I've noticed about a lot of boomers is that, you know, again, that a lot of the stuff that they do, the politics they engage in, the behavior they engage in, is more or less just a reflection of the period that they grew up in, which was incredibly privileged. Like I said, I'm not even mad that they grew up in that period in human history. I'm not mad that they have prosperity. What I do hate is that they first tell us and lie to us, saying that if we work as hard as them, we'll end up as successful as them, which they're lying. And then second of all, they try to gaslight that this history of theirs never even existed, and then pretend it never existed to try and justify why younger generations have to deal with more shit than they had to deal with. And it's just the deception, the lying, and the gaslighting is what I hate most about boomers. With that being said, I think I'm going to go ahead and close off the video. Tell me what you think about boomers, and you think that this is an accurate reflection of their existence, or do you think I'm just being a little bit uncharitable? You know, drop your 2 cents. If you like the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So you guys have a good evening.